It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, the kind of place where the church steeple was taller than the courthouse dome, and Friday night football drew more people than city hall meetings. In a corner of rural Georgia, one man stood taller than them all, not because of his height or his build, but because of the badge on his chest and the reputation that trailed behind him like a shadow. Sheriff Clayton Briggs. For over 2 decades, he was the face of law and order in Pine Hollow County. The man folks pointed to when they told their children, "That's what justice looks like." Clayton carried himself the way a sheriff was supposed to, boots polished, uniform crisp, hat tilted just right under the southern sun. He wasn't just another lawman in a small-town department. He was the lawman, the kind who showed up to church on Sunday morning and bowed his head in the front pew, then patrolled the back roads at midnight to make sure teenagers weren't running wild. People believed in him, trusted him. To the outside world, Pine Hollow might have seemed like just another dusty Georgia town. But to the folks who lived there, it was safe because Sheriff Briggs stood watch. Stories about his toughness filled diner booths and barbershop chairs. How he'd once faced down 2 armed robbers at the corner store and talked them into surrendering without firing a single shot. How he shut down a meth lab hidden deep in the swamps, dragging out suspects while mosquitoes swarmed around his head. He was old school, firm handshake, square jaw, no patience for excuses. When he walked into a room, conversation stopped until he was the one who broke the silence. Parents wanted their kids to grow up with his kind of backbone. Politicians asked for his endorsement because in Pine Hollow, the sheriff's word carried more weight than any campaign flyer. But what set him apart wasn't just what he did in uniform. It was the image he projected outside of it. At town festivals, he flipped burgers for the fire department fundraiser. When storms knocked out power, he drove from house to house, checking on elderly residents and delivering bags of ice. Christmas morning, when most men stayed home in pajamas with their families, he put on his boots and made sure the roads were clear. He cultivated the image of a man who lived and breathed duty. And people loved him for it. They needed him to be exactly who he said he was: tough, incorruptible, untouchable. Behind the badge, though, he wasn't without flaws, and some folks whispered about that too. They said no man could work as many late nights as Clayton without picking up bad habits. They said he had a temper, that he sometimes drank more than he let on. But in a town where gossip ran faster than the river, none of it ever stuck. The legend of Sheriff Briggs was cleaner, stronger, bigger than the man himself. And legends don't get questioned. Still, the longer he wore the badge, the heavier it became. He was in his late 50s now, his hair gone salt and pepper, his eyes lined from years of squinting in the sun. But when he shook your hand, it was still firm. When he stood in front of camera, his voice was still steady. People never noticed the tiredness in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when certain subjects came up. They saw only what they wanted to see, the last honest man in Georgia. And that image mattered more than anything. In Pine Hollow, law and morality weren't written in books or statutes. They were lived out through the sheriff's example. His deputies followed his lead. The courts leaned on his testimony, and the town's sense of right and wrong rested squarely on his shoulders. There wasn't a father in town who didn't want his son to grow into that kind of man. There wasn't a mother who didn't sleep easier knowing Clayton was out there, patrolling. He embodied safety. He embodied control. But in stories like these, control is never as solid as it seems. For all the parades and handshakes, for all the talk of duty and sacrifice, a man still has to wrestle with the private hours when no one's watching. And the truth about Sheriff Briggs was that he had a private life nobody could have imagined. A secret that didn't fit the picture-perfect portrait of a hometown hero. It wasn't gambling or drugs or taking bribes, nothing like that. It was something stranger, something people would whisper about in disbelief once the story finally broke. For now, though, on the surface, everything looked as it always had. Sheriff Briggs was the guardian of Pine Hollow, the man who could do no wrong, the one whose name was spoken with respect even by those who feared him. Yet under the calm surface of this little Georgia town, a storm was brewing. And soon, the sheriff's carefully built image, the legend he had lived by for decades, was about to shatter in a way no one could have predicted. By the time the sun rose on that hot summer morning, the town's symbol of justice would be found in a place no one ever expected, his reputation soaked in scandal, his body riddled with bullets. And Pine Hollow would never look at Sheriff Clayton Briggs the same way again. On the very edge of Pine Hollow, past the last paved street and down a gravel road most folks never bother to drive, there sat a weathered mobile home with sagging steps and curtains pulled so tight you couldn't see inside. People said the woman who lived there rarely came out, except late at night when she'd slip into the corner store to buy groceries. Her name was Leverne, though most of the town only knew her as that big lady out by the woods. To say she stood out would be an understatement. Leverne weighed over 500 pounds, her body filling doorways and booths like she didn't belong in the spaces ordinary people occupied. But her size wasn't the only thing that kept her apart. She lived like a ghost, avoiding community events, never attending church, never lingering on her porch. If you pass by her mobile home, you might hear the faint hum of a TV or smell food cooking, but you almost never saw her outside. Neighbors, few as they were, whispered that she wanted it that way. Maybe she didn't want the stares. Maybe she didn't want the pity. Or maybe she had secrets of her own. For the kids who biked down that road on dares, she became a legend, the giant woman in the trailer. They told stories of her watching from the window with cold eyes, or of footsteps thundering inside when you knocked and ran. Adults weren't much kinder. At the diner, folks rolled their eyes and said things like, "Bless her heart," but she brought that life on herself. In small towns, you don't get to be different without being noticed, and Leverne was as different as they came. And yet, despite her reclusiveness, there were sightings. More than a few people claimed they'd seen a county-issued SUV parked outside her place late at night, the kind only one man drove. At first, they chalked it up to routine patrol, maybe the sheriff checking in on an isolated resident. But it kept happening. Same vehicle, same hours, same trailer hidden by the tree line. Eventually, people stopped believing it was just patrol work. One woman who lived nearby told her sister she saw Sheriff Briggs knock on the door one night, carrying a brown paper bag like he'd just come from the liquor store. Another neighbor swore she heard laughter through the thin summer air, the kind of laughter that didn't belong to a sheriff sitting with a lonely resident. It was playful, intimate, almost conspiratorial. And while no one dared confront Clayton about it, the talk began to spread in low voices. What was a man like him doing at a place like that, with a woman like her? The truth, or at least what people pieced together, was that Briggs and Leverne had a secret arrangement. Some thought it was pity, that the sheriff visited out of kindness, giving a lonely woman company. Others believed it was desire, raw and hidden, that drove him out there. And then there were the darker theories, that she had something on him, some piece of leverage she used to keep him coming back. No one knew for sure. What they did know was that he kept going back, and every time he did, it chipped away at the legend of Pine Hollow's untouchable sheriff. Leverne herself never spoke about it. When the cashier at the gas station tried to make small talk, she would just nod, her eyes darting toward the floor. When a deputy once drove past her trailer and waved, she didn't wave back. She seemed to exist in two states, invisible to most of the world, but somehow central to the biggest mystery in town. For years, she had been the woman on the margins, someone most folks ignored. But now, thanks to those late-night visits, she was woven into the sheriff's story. A 500-pound woman in a rusting mobile home didn't fit the image people had of Clayton Briggs. And yet, there it was, a connection no one could quite explain, but everyone wanted to gossip about. The whispers carried a sharp edge. Some people sneered, saying the sheriff must have been desperate to be caught up with her. Others shook their heads in judgment, as though his association with Leverne wasn't just a scandal, but a humiliation. And in a town where appearances mattered, where reputation could make or break a man, the very idea of their secret liaisons was enough to send shockwaves through Pine Hollow's tightly wound sense of order. Still, nobody confronted him. Nobody dared. It was easier to whisper at kitchen tables and church picnics, to share sideways glances when his cruiser passed by, to let the rumors swell without ever bursting. But those who saw the SUV parked there knew the truth wasn't rumor. It was fact. Sheriff Clayton Briggs was spending time with the woman everyone else shunned. And while the town may not have known what went on behind those closed curtains, one thing was certain. Whatever bound the sheriff and Leverne together would one day pull both of them into the kind of story Pine Hollow had never seen before. By the time it did, the whispers would turn into shouts, and the quiet, lonely mobile home would become the center of a storm no one could contain. The night that changed everything began like so many others in Pine Hollow. Still, humid, and heavy with the scent of pine trees and red clay. Sheriff Clayton Briggs finished his evening rounds just after 9, his patrol car rolling slowly down Main Street where porch lights glowed and crickets hummed in the distance. To anyone watching, it looked like another night of routine, another evening where the sheriff made sure his town was safe before heading home. But Clayton wasn't driving toward his house. He was steering his cruiser down the back roads that led out toward the edge of town, the gravel stretch where Laverne's trailer sat shrouded in darkness. The clock on his dash ticked past 10 when he turned off his headlights a few yards early, as if he didn't want his approach to be noticed. The gravel crunched beneath his tires until he parked at the edge of her lot, the faint glow of her porch light casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. A neighbor sitting out for a late smoke glanced up, and though he couldn't see clearly through the trees, he recognized the shape of the sheriff's SUV. He took a long drag, exhaled into the night, and filed it away in his memory. Inside the trailer, voices carried faintly through the thin aluminum walls. A radio played low, an old blues station, and laughter followed. A couple of times, a burst of sound rose high enough for the closest neighbor to hear, the kind of laughter that told you people weren't just talking, they were sharing something private. Then came silence, the sort of silence that hangs heavy, where you know something is happening but can't quite name it. Around midnight, a pair of headlights passed down the gravel road, illuminating the sheriff's car for only a moment before fading into the distance. The witness driving by later told police he remembered thinking it odd, a patrol SUV parked in front of that trailer at such an hour. But he kept moving, chalking it up to business he had no reason to question. Hours dragged by, and the night thickened. Somewhere around 2 a.m., a neighbor swore she heard a strange thud, followed by what might have been a muffled cry. She brushed it off, telling herself it could have been the TV or the shifting weight of the trailer settling in the damp ground. Pine Hollow wasn't the kind of place where people called in every noise they heard. They minded their business. By 4 in the morning, the gravel road was empty again, the sheriff's cruiser still parked in its spot, moonlight glinting off the county emblem on its door. Then, just before dawn, the vehicle was gone. No engine roar to wake the neighbors. No squeal of tires. Just gone, as if it had vanished in a thin air. When the sun rose, the trailer sat quiet. Curtains drawn. No sound, no movement. It stayed that way for hours until late morning, when a relative of Laverne's, worried after not hearing from her, stopped by to check. What he found would sear itself into Pine Hollow's memory. The door wasn't locked. He stepped inside and was struck first by the smell, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. The living room was in slight disarray, a chair pushed out of place, a glass overturned on the floor. He called out her name, then froze when he saw the trail of dark stains leading down the short hallway. His heart pounded as he followed it to the back bedroom, and that's where he found him. Sheriff Clayton Briggs, the man who had been the backbone of the town for decades, lay sprawled across the sagging mattress. His body was twisted at an angle, the once crisp uniform shirt he had worn now torn open and soaked through with blood. The sheets beneath him were saturated, sticky in the summer heat. 10 bullet holes riddled his torso, each one tearing through the legend piece by piece. His service weapon sat untouched on the nightstand, holstered as though he'd never had the chance, or never thought he'd need, to reach for it. The relative stumbled back in horror, fumbling for his phone. His 911 call was panicked, his voice breaking as he tried to explain. The sheriff was dead, there was blood everywhere, and Leverne was nowhere to be found. Within minutes, sirens shattered the morning calm. Deputies, investigators, paramedics, they all converged on the lonely mobile home that had become a crime scene. The image of Sheriff Briggs lying on that bed would haunt every person who walked through that door. To the deputies who had idolized him, It felt like the ground had split open beneath their feet. To the neighbors, it confirmed every rumor and every whisper that the sheriff's private life wasn't what it seemed. To the media, it was the kind of scandal that would ignite headlines across the state. The untouchable lawman gunned down in the bed of a woman the town had shunned. Outside, the flashing lights of squad cars drew a crowd. People pressed against the yellow tape, murmuring in disbelief. Some cried openly. Others shook their heads, already speculating. And through it all, one fact remained as shocking as it was undeniable. The sheriff was dead, killed in a place no one expected, with the one woman no one thought could be at the center of such violence. As investigators began their work, questions flooded in faster than answers. Why 10 shots? Who pulled the trigger? And where in the world was Leverne? The night had begun with secrecy, with laughter and shadows, but it ended in a storm of blood and bullets. By morning, Pine Hollow would never be the same. By the time the first investigators crossed the threshold of Leverne's mobile home, the heat of the Georgia morning was already thick, pressing down like a weight. The air inside was worse, stale, heavy with the residue of gunpowder and smoke. It hit the deputies as soon as they stepped through the door, a smell that clung to their clothes and hair, a smell they knew would linger long after the case was over. Sheriff Clayton Briggs lay on the sagging mattress in the back bedroom, and even the most seasoned officers faltered at the sight. 10 bullet wounds, clustered across his chest and abdomen, made it clear this wasn't an accident or a crime of passion gone out of control. It was execution. Whoever pulled the trigger hadn't fired once and fled. They'd stood there long enough to make sure he wasn't leaving that bed alive. His blood had soaked deep into the sheets, spreading in jagged patterns across the thin mattress. The room itself was small, claustrophobic, with only one window cracked open to let in a sliver of sunlight. Yet there was no sign of forced entry, no shattered glass, no kicked-in door. The sheriff's service weapon sat neatly on the nightstand, fully loaded. His badge was tucked into the breast pocket of his shirt, untouched. The message was chilling. The man who had embodied law and order for Pine Hollow hadn't even raised a hand to defend himself. Whether it was because he trusted the person in that room, or because he was caught so completely off guard, no one could say. The deputy coroner arrived and began the grim task of documenting the scene. Photographs captured every angle. The placement of the body, the streak of blood on the wall, the overturned lamp, the indentation in the cheap carpet where a chair had been pushed aside. Forensic techs collected 10 shell casings from the floor, all clustered near the foot of the bed. The weapon had likely been a semi-automatic handgun, but which model and whose hand had held it remained unknown. What puzzled investigators most was what wasn't there. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on the sheriff's hands or arms, no fingerprints beyond the expected smudges belonging to Leverne herself. And Leverne was gone. The refrigerator still hummed, half-stocked with leftovers. A coffee mug sat in the sink. Clothes were scattered in a laundry basket by the door. But the woman who weighed more than 500 pounds had vanished as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The neighbors who gathered behind the crime scene traded stories in hushed voices. One man swore he saw the sheriff's cruiser around midnight. Another claimed he heard a strange noise near 2 in the morning. But no one had seen Leverne leave. And for a woman of her size, disappearing without someone noticing seemed almost impossible. By noon, local reporters had arrived, their vans parked in a row along the gravel shoulder. Cameras rolled as deputies carried out the stretcher, the sheet draped over what was left of the most powerful man in Pine Hollow. The sight of that body being wheeled into the coroner's then sent a ripple of disbelief through the crowd. Some gasped, others shook their heads. A few whispered prayers, and already rumors were spinning out of control. Did she kill him? One woman murmured to her friend. No, that many shots? That's a hit job. Somebody wanted him gone. Maybe she lured him there. Maybe she was in on it. Every theory carried the same undertone. Shame. To die in uniform, protecting your community, that was a hero's death. To die in the bed of a 500-pound woman on the edge of town, that was scandal. And for a sheriff who had built his entire identity on reputation, it was the cruelest twist of all. Inside the sheriff's department, shock turned quickly to chaos. Deputies who had once looked to Briggs for guidance now sat in silence, their radios crackling with updates from the scene. Some refused to believe what they were hearing until they saw it themselves. Others stared at the floor, their faces pale, grief mixed with embarrassment, because every lawman knew the questions that would come next. What was the sheriff doing there? What did this mean for their department? For their town? The Georgia Bureau of Investigation sent agents that afternoon. Suits and ties, polished shoes crunching on the gravel as they walked the perimeter of the trailer. They interviewed neighbors, cataloged evidence, and ordered a sweep of the woods in case Leverne had tried to run. But there were no tracks in the dirt, no broken branches leading away, just silence and heat. The medical examiner later confirmed what everyone already suspected. All 10 bullets were fired at close range, within a few feet. Each shot had been deliberate, grouped tightly enough to suggest either a practiced hand or someone driven by rage. None of the rounds had been fatal on their own, but together they left no chance of survival. Briggs had been dead within minutes, if not seconds. By evening, the story had already spread beyond Pine Hollow. News anchors in Atlanta spoke of the fallen sheriff, hinting at scandal without saying too much. Social media caught fire with speculation. Hashtags bearing his name trended, alongside crude jokes about the circumstances of his death. For a man who had once seemed untouchable, the descent into rumor and ridicule was swift. Back in town, people lit candles on the courthouse steps, gathering in small groups to mourn. Some wept openly, clutching homemade signs that read justice for Sheriff Briggs. Others stayed away, unwilling to be seen honoring a man whose private choices were now exposed. Pine Hollow, once united under his authority, was suddenly divided by shock, shame, and suspicion. And through it all, the biggest question loomed unanswered. Where was Leverne? Had she pulled the trigger herself? Had she been a pawn in someone else's game? Or had she, too, met a darker fate, erased to cover up the truth? What had begun as a night like any other had ended with a crime scene that would haunt Pine Hollow forever. And as investigators packed up their gear and the last camera crews drove away, one thing was certain. The image of Sheriff Clayton Briggs lying in that bed, riddled with bullets, would never leave the town's memory. The investigation into Sheriff Clayton Briggs's death began before his body was even cold. By the time the coroner's van pulled away from the gravel lot, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had already claimed jurisdiction, and the sheriff's own deputies, still reeling from grief and humiliation, were ordered to step back. It was a bitter pill for them to swallow, standing behind yellow tape while strangers combed through their boss's final moments. But the symbolism was clear. When the lawman himself became the victim, trust in the local department evaporated. The GBI team worked methodically. They photographed every inch of the trailer, bagged the shell casings, dusted for fingerprints, and logged items that seemed out of place. The overturned glass in the living room, the faint scuff mark near the doorway, the half-empty bottle of whiskey tucked under the bed. Outside, agents surveyed the gravel drive, looking for tire impressions. They noted the faint parallel lines of heavy treads, possibly from a truck, but the ground was too dry to preserve clear detail. Almost immediately, the focus turned to the woman who wasn't there. Leverne, the 500-pound recluse, had vanished into thin air. Investigators canvassed the area, knocking on trailer doors, asking anyone who might have seen her leave. Not a soul claimed to. And that was the problem. A woman her size didn't just slip out unnoticed. She had help, one agent muttered, scribbling in his notebook. Or she never left at all. The first theory was the simplest. Leverne pulled the trigger. The sheriff, caught in a compromising situation, ended up on the wrong end of her fury. Maybe he'd threatened to leave her, or maybe she felt used, discarded after years of secrecy. 10 bullets could easily be explained as rage. A woman scorned, unleashing all her humiliation and anger in one violent burst. But even as this theory circulated, holes began to show. How had she gotten a weapon? Why were there no signs of struggle? And most damning of all, how had she disappeared, leaving no trace, no footprints, no vehicle of her own? The second theory was darker. and far more unsettling. What if Leverne wasn't the killer at all, but bait? A trap carefully set to lure Briggs into the perfect kill zone. Someone knew his secret, knew he would sneak out under cover of darkness, and used it against him. Once he was inside that trailer, relaxed, vulnerable, the shooter could step in and finish the job. 10 rounds, close range, and gone before dawn. If this was true, it meant the sheriff's private shame had been turned into his execution ground. Within days, more details fed the speculation. Ballistics testing revealed the casings came from a Glock 19, a weapon common among both law enforcement and criminals in the region. Investigators sent out feelers to see if the serial number could be traced, but the gun itself hadn't been recovered. Without it, the lead stalled. Neighbors were re-interviewed. One man admitted he'd heard a vehicle around 5 a.m., larger than a car, maybe a pickup truck heading down the road. Another insisted she'd seen 2 shadows moving near the trailer in the early hours. But eyewitness accounts in the half-light of dawn were flimsy, and the GBI treated them with caution. Inside the sheriff's department, tensions rose. Deputies whispered among themselves about what Briggs might have been involved in. Some refused to believe their leader had secrets, while others privately admitted the rumors didn't surprise them. One deputy even suggested the sheriff had been covering up dirt within the force itself, and that someone inside might have wanted him silenced. The GBI didn't dismiss it outright. They pulled phone records, examined case files Briggs had been working on, and flagged anything that smelled of corruption. The media fanned the flames. Headlines in Atlanta screamed, "Sheriff slain Iron Lover's bed." Talk radio hosts speculated about mob connections, drug cartels, and betrayal from within his own ranks. National outlets picked up the story, turning Pine Hollow's scandal into a spectacle. In living rooms across America, people debated whether Briggs was a fallen hero or a hypocrite who got what was coming. Meanwhile, the search for Leverne intensified. Posters with her photo, grainy, outdated, the only one authorities could find, were plastered on bulletin boards and gas station windows. Tips trickled in. She'd been spotted at a bus station in Macon, someone claimed. Another swore they saw her hitchhiking on Route 16. Each lead collapsed under scrutiny. The truth was simpler and more haunting. No one knew where she was, or if she was even alive. As days turned to weeks, the theories hardened. Law enforcement split into camps. Some believed wholeheartedly that Leverne had snapped and killed the sheriff in a storm of bullets. Others believed she had been set up, her disappearance evidence that she, too, had been silenced by whoever really orchestrated the murder. The only thing they agreed on was this. Nothing about the crime scene added up to an easy answer. In Pine Hollow, the gossip grew uglier. At church suppers and grocery store aisles, people whispered that maybe Leverne had been blackmailing the sheriff. Others said she was part of a criminal network, her reclusive life a perfect cover. A few defended her, insisting she was just lonely, that the sheriff had taken advantage of her isolation. But the dominant mood was suspicion. If she was innocent, why hadn't she come forward? If she was guilty, how had she managed to vanish? The GBI called a press conference 2 weeks after the murder. Standing at a podium under the blazing sun, the lead investigator outlined the facts. The sheriff had been shot 10 times, no weapon recovered. The prime person of interest, Leverne, still missing. He urged the public not to jump to conclusions, but his words did little to calm the storm. Every answer raised more questions, and Pine Hollow was drowning in them. And somewhere beneath the swirl of rumors and theories, one chilling possibility remained. Sheriff Briggs hadn't been killed by a scorned lover or a passing criminal. He'd been executed as part of something much larger, a conspiracy that reached far beyond the walls of a mobile home at the edge of town. Whether the truth would ever be uncovered or buried alongside the sheriff himself was a question that gnawed at the investigators and the people he'd once sworn to protect. Whispers about Sheriff Clayton Briggs had always existed in Pine Hollow, though most folks were too respectful or too afraid to repeat them out loud. After his death, those whispers roared into the open. For every story of heroism and honor, there was now a counter-story, darker and far more complicated. And as the Georgia Bureau of Investigation dug deeper into the sheriff's past, it became clear that the man who once seemed untouchable had been standing on quicksand all along. At first, it was small things. Expense reports that didn't quite line up. Hours logged on patrol that no deputy could verify. Then came sealed case files with missing evidence tags, discrepancies too sharp to be chalked up to sloppy record keeping. Investigators combing through years of reports began to see a pattern. Drug seizures that ended with lighter charges than expected, known dealers whose cases evaporated before trial. It wasn't proof of corruption, not yet, but it painted a troubling picture. Reporters, hungry for blood, sniffed out these leads almost as quickly as the GBI did. Articles began appearing in Atlanta papers suggesting Briggs had long been cozy with local business owners, taking donations that doubled as protection money. One piece claimed a known meth supplier had once been pulled over with a trunk full of pills and walked away with nothing more than a warning, because he was a cousin of a man who had bankrolled Briggs's re-election. Inside the department, the cracks widened. Deputies who once defended their boss now found themselves questioning what they had seen but ignored. One remembered Briggs ordering him to drop surveillance on a suspected gang safe house, brushing it off with the words, "Not our priority right now." Another admitted he'd seen Briggs pocket cash during a raid, though he convinced himself at the time it was just evidence handling. Loyalty had blinded them. Now, those memories looked like complicity. The GBI widened their net, interviewing former deputies who had quit under mysterious circumstances. One, a man named Henry Latham, told investigators that Briggs had pressured him to falsify a report 5 years earlier. When Latham refused, he found himself pushed out of the force within months. He dominated the system in Pine Hollow. You crossed him, you were done. But the most explosive lead came from an unlikely source, a stack of phone records pulled from the sheriff's personal cell. Buried among the mundane calls to family and local officials were dozens of late-night conversations with numbers tied to known criminal figures. One belonged to a bar owner under investigation for laundering money. Another traced back to a man rumored to be running guns through the county. Each call lasted several minutes, sometimes more than an hour, and many coincided with the nights his SUV was spotted outside Leverne's trailer. To the GBI, the implications were chilling. Was Briggs using his secret relationship with Leverne as cover, parking at her home while conducting shady business with criminals over the phone? Or was the trailer itself a meeting ground, a place far enough from town to talk without prying eyes? As these revelations trickled into the press, Pine Hollow's grief curdled into outrage. Town hall meetings turned into shouting matches. Some residents refused to believe the allegations, insisting the sheriff's record spoke for itself. "He put his life on the line for us," one woman shouted, clutching a framed photo of Briggs shaking her son's hand at school assembly. But others weren't so forgiving. "If half of this is true," a man retorted, "then we've been living under a lie for 20 years. The sheriff's family, his wife, his grown children, found themselves in the middle of the storm. Reporters camped outside their home, shoving microphones through car windows. One night, his daughter broke down in tears during a televised interview, begging people to remember her father as the man he had been to her, not the monster the media was making him out to be. But sympathy was in short supply. The narrative had shifted. The hero had fallen, and the public wanted answers. Meanwhile, the GBI struggled to determine whether Briggs's secrets were connected to his death. Was he executed because of what he knew, or because of what he did? The brutality of the murder suggested anger, but the precision suggested something more calculated. 10 rounds weren't fired in panic. They were fired with purpose. If Briggs had been protecting criminal networks, it was entirely possible one of them decided his time was up. Yet the mystery of Leverne remained tangled in all of it. If she had been his lover, had she known about his corruption? Had she been part of it? Or was she simply a witness who had now vanished, either in fear or because someone made sure she would never talk? Each possibility opened new doors and closed others. As summer stretched on, the case became less about finding the sheriff's killer and more about unmasking the sheriff himself. Pine Hollow was left reeling from the realization that their champion of justice might have been a shield for criminals all along. And yet, without a definitive answer, the town was trapped between two truths: the memory of the man they thought they knew, and the shadow of the man he may have really been. In the end, one thing was undeniable. Sheriff Clayton Briggs had secrets, and those secrets were as deadly as the 10 bullets that tore through him. Whether he was killed for betraying his oath or for daring to cross the wrong people, the badge he wore had become both his armor and his curse. And for Pine Hollow, the line between lawman and outlaw would never look the same again. For weeks, the story of Sheriff Clayton Briggs's murder had revolved around one haunting absence: Leverne. The 500-pound woman who lived in that sagging mobile home on the edge of Pine Hollow was no longer just a recluse whispered about by neighbors. She was the missing piece of a puzzle that consumed the entire county. Every newscast repeated her name. Every headline paired her face with words like mystery, suspect, lure. And yet, behind the caricature, there was a real woman with a past, a pain, and a truth that made her far more than the one-dimensional figure the town wanted to believe. Investigators started by pulling her records. What they found was a history steeped in tragedy. Laverne Harris had been born and raised in Pine Hollow. In high school, she'd been quiet but bright, a girl who loved to draw and dreamed of studying art. But ridicule came early. Classmates taunted her for her size. Teachers dismissed her talents. And by the time she was 17, she had dropped out entirely. Over the years, her isolation grew with her body. By 30, she weighed over 400 pounds. By 40, she had nearly disappeared from public life, retreating into her mobile home after the death of her mother. People who had known her in her younger years told investigators she wasn't dangerous, just broken. A cousin described her as gentle, soft-spoken, almost afraid of her own shadow. A childhood friend remembered that she always carried sketchbooks, drawing faces she wished would smile at her instead of mock her. But somewhere along the way, those sketchbooks had been put away, and Leverne had become the town's ghost. That ghost, however, had somehow captured the attention of the most powerful man in Pine Hollow. Neighbors had sworn they saw the sheriff's cruiser parked outside her trailer on more than one occasion. Phone records now confirmed late-night calls between Briggs and Leverne stretching back over a year. The tone of those conversations couldn't be recovered, but the frequency spoke volumes. Whatever the nature of their relationship, it hadn't been a one-time lapse. Theories bloomed. Some said she was his secret mistress, their relationship fueled by loneliness on both sides. Hers from years of isolation, his from the crushing expectations of being Pine Hollow's symbol of justice. Others painted her as a manipulator, a woman who finally realized the power she had over a man desperate to keep his reputation spotless. In that version, she wasn't a victim at all, but a blackmailer, pulling him back again and again with the threat of exposure. But there was a third theory, whispered in darker corners, that Leverne herself was a pawn, that someone had used her isolation, her vulnerability, to bait the sheriff into the perfect trap. It would explain the execution-style killing. It would explain her disappearance. Maybe she hadn't fled at all. Maybe she had been silenced along with him. When investigators searched her trailer, they found little in the way of answers. Clothes in her closet, sketches stuffed into a drawer, grocery lists on the counter. Nothing to suggest she had planned to run. Her bank account was untouched, her Social Security checks still uncashed. If she had gone into hiding, she hadn't prepared for it. That pointed to two possibilities. She had been taken against her will, or she had been killed and hidden away. Still, there were tantalizing hints of a more complex connection between her and Briggs. A spiral notebook recovered from her bedroom contained pages of handwriting, some hers, some apparently his. The entries weren't explicit confessions, but they read like conversations captured on paper. Phrases like "you promised" and "I can't be seen with you in town" suggested a relationship that had soured, one in which trust and secrecy battled constantly. The notebook was entered into evidence, though neither side of the debate, lover or pawn, claimed victory with it. Meanwhile, the public narrative spun out of control. On social media, cruel jokes reduced her to nothing more than her weight, painting her as a grotesque seductress who had lured the sheriff to his doom. Talk shows debated whether a man like Briggs could truly have been involved with a woman like that, as if her body was the only story worth telling. But those who had known her shook their heads at the spectacle. To them, Leverne was complicated, fragile, lonely, maybe desperate for connection, but not the monster people wanted her to be. The GBI, careful not to fuel the circus, kept their statements measured. Officially, Leverne remained a person of interest. Unofficially, some investigators admitted they doubted she had the physical ability to stage such a killing, not without help. 10 rounds fired with precision was no easy feat, especially for someone without firearms training. If she had pulled the trigger, it would have required strength and focus many believe she didn't have. But if she hadn't, then she was either complicit or collateral. And then came the strangest detail of all. A trucker passing through Pine Hollow in the early hours of the morning swore he saw a large figure being helped in the back of a pickup along the highway. The time matched roughly with the window investigators believed the sheriff had been killed. He didn't report it then, just assumed it was someone catching a ride. But when he came forward weeks later, it added a chilling new possibility, that Leverne hadn't disappeared on her own at all. She had been taken. If true, that meant she might have been the key to everything, willingly or not. She could have been the witness who saw too much, or the lure used to draw Briggs into his grave. Either way, her story was no longer a sideshow to the sheriff scandal. It was central. In the end, Pine Hollow was left with 2 ghosts. The fallen sheriff whose reputation lay in tatters, and the 500-pound woman who had vanished into the night. Whether Leverne was a killer, a victim, or something in between, her absence was as loud as a gunshot. And until the truth came to light, the town would keep whispering her name, adding new layers to a mystery that refused to die. By the end of that long Georgia summer, the murder of Sheriff Clayton Briggs had transformed from a shocking crime into something more like folklore. The investigation dragged on, with no clear resolution. Every week the GBI held press briefings, offering fragments of evidence and appeals for tips, but nothing ever tied the threads together. The trail grew colder with each passing day. And in Pine Hollow, where people once spoke of the sheriff with reverence, his name became shorthand for scandal, betrayal, and unanswered questions. His funeral had been a spectacle. The governor sent a wreath. Law enforcement agencies across the state dispatched officers in full dress uniform, and bagpipes echoed across the cemetery as the sheriff was lowered into the ground. Yet the grief was fractured. Some in attendance cried openly, clutching folded flags to their chests. Others whispered in the back rows, debating whether he even deserved the honors. On social media, photographs of the funeral procession clashed with crude memes mocking the circumstances of his death. The man who had spent decades building an image of control was now remembered just as often for the scandal that undid him. For his family, the aftermath was unbearable. His widow refused interviews, barricading herself inside their home while reporters camped on her lawn. His children, grown and scattered across the state, split in how they handled the storm. His eldest son defended him fiercely, insisting his father had been set up, a victim of enemies in law enforcement and beyond. His daughter, more quietly, admitted in one rare interview that Dad wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve this. The contradictions mirrored what the town itself was struggling to reconcile. Was he the protector they once trusted, or a man who lost himself in secrets? And then there was Leverne. Her absence became its own kind of haunting. People swore they spotted her in neighboring counties, in a Walmart parking lot, on a Greyhound bus heading south. None of the sightings were confirmed. Some believed she was dead, her body buried somewhere far from the mobile home where the sheriff bled out. Others swore she was alive, hiding under a new name, too terrified to come forward. A few conspiracy-minded locals insisted she was being protected, hidden away by the very people who orchestrated the sheriff's execution. Whatever the truth, her ghostly presence lingered in every conversation, every rumor, every uneasy glance when her name was mentioned. The GBI never announced a suspect. Their final report, issued nearly a year after the murder, read more like a riddle than a resolution. It confirmed what people already knew. 10 shots from a Glock 19, no signs of forced entry, a timeline that placed the sheriff alive at midnight and dead by dawn. It acknowledged Leverne as a person of interest, but stopped short of naming her a killer. It noted possible connections to criminal networks, but admitted no direct evidence tied them to the scene. The words insufficient evidence appeared over and over. For a town that wanted closure, the report was salt in the wound. Pine Hollow tried to move forward, but the shadow of the case never lifted. The sheriff's department struggled to rebuild its reputation, led by a new appointee who promised transparency and accountability. But citizens looked at their deputies differently now, wondering what else had been hidden in plain sight. At the diner, where Briggs once sat at the counter with his morning coffee, his old seat stayed empty, not out of respect, but because nobody wanted to claim it. The town square, once dominated by his presence, now felt smaller, diminished, like part of its confidence had been ripped away. Yet the story refused to die. Podcasters descended on Pine Hollow, turning the case into serialized episodes that blended fact with speculation. National news shows ran anniversary specials, revisiting the crime scene with dramatic music and drone footage of the gravel road. On TikTok and Twitter, strangers debated whether Leverne had been a mastermind or a patsy. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Briggs and hashtag Where is Leverne trended side by side, each fueled by people who had never set foot in Georgia. The locals hated it but couldn't escape it. The case had become larger than Pine Hollow, a story America consumed with morbid fascination. And every retelling forced the people who had lived through it to relive the shame, the confusion, and the grief. In the end, the legacy of Sheriff Clayton Briggs was not a single story, but a tangle of contradictions. To some, he would always be the lawman who protected their families, who stood tall against criminals and made Pine Hollow feel safe. To others, he was the hypocrite who betrayed his oath, whose double life ended in a bed soaked with scandal. And for everyone, he was a reminder that even the strongest myths can crumble in an instant. The gravel road where it all happened grew over with weeds. The mobile home sat abandoned, its windows broken, its steps rotting, the curtains fluttering in the wind like ghostly flags. People avoided it, crossing to the other side of the road rather than walk past. Children whispered that the sheriff's spirit haunted the place, still wearing his badge, still bleeding from 10 bullet holes. Adults laughed nervously when they heard it, but none dared test the tale after dark. Time dulled the edges, but it never erased the questions. Who killed him? Why 10 bullets? Where did Leverne go? No answers ever came. Only theories stacked on theories, each one less satisfying than the last. Pine Hollow learned to live with the silence, to carry the weight of a mystery that would never be solved. And so the sheriff's story ended not with justice, but with uncertainty. A man who had been the very definition of order left behind nothing but chaos. His different legacies, hero, villain, victim, fraud, clashed in memory, refusing to settle into one neat truth. For Pine Hollow, the legend of Sheriff Briggs became a cautionary tale, that no matter how solid the pedestal, every man is breakable, every secret can surface, and sometimes the only thing left behind is the echo of gunfire in the dark.